but now I'm at University of Virginia. That's my current affiliation.
Over on the side.
Design.
Yeah, poke.
Thank you. During the initial Spanish colonization of New Mexico in 1598, Euro-American settlers encountered an environment that was already heavily modified by the indigenous inhabitants of the region. This was because Puebloan communities had long established complex agricultural regimes that created diverse anthropogenic landscapes uniquely adapted to the arid conditions of the Southwest. The Spanish colonial project required the implementation of new agricultural regimes which contrasted with existing indigenous ones. This involved not only new crops, but also new methods, temporal organization, and evaluation of resources. Using palynological data, this paper aims to understand how Hispanic strategies of land use associated with the archaeological site LA 20,000 were implemented in the Spanish colony of New Mexico in relation to pre-existing systems utilized by indigenous inhabitants. Furthermore, it will examine how these strategies alter the relationships with existing plant communities. The archaeological site LA 20,000 is ideally situated to understand how the environmental aspects of landscape modification were negotiated in the Rio Grande Valley during the first period of colonization. The site was a Spanish homestead or rancho established in the early 17th century. And looking at this map here, Santa Fe is up here near the top of the Camino Real. And this little jog in the road, right about this turn, is where LA 20,000 would be located. The site was Spanish Rancho, located about 12 miles southwest of the colonial capital of Santa Fe. It's one of only 9 rural home sites identified in the 17th century, making it a vital part of the archaeological record. Additionally, the site is within several miles of at least 2 known Puebloan villages that were contemporaneous or existed not long before colonization. By examining the environmental change in the immediate vicinity of the homestead, we can begin to understand the complex ecological processes occurring as a result of colonial landscape modification, as well as how Hispanic settlers understood the existing space of New Mexico. And this is an excavation map of the site. And what we have here is the main house and a barn facility over here. And this is an aerial photograph in which you can actually see the outline of this building. This kind of greenish rectangle is the footprint of this very large Spanish homestead. And then here we have the location of the site in relation to known pueblos. And the 2 that are closest are La Cienega 2 and LA 1098, which fall within a couple of miles of the main Spanish homestead. Prior to the beginning of the Hispanic colonization, New Mexico was home to substantial and diverse indigenous communities. In the 17th century, Puebloan peoples alone occupied approximately 81 separate villages with a population numbering around 60,000 persons. Pueblo villages were remarkably similar in both their physical construction and their subsistence practices, which relied on the cultivation of Zea maize as a dietary staple. This meant that space and time were heavily regulated by tasks associated with maize production, including field preparation, harvesting, field maintenance, water management, and grain processing. As a result, Puebloan villages remained relatively sedentary, investing in agricultural strategies that could limit risk and increase crop yields. These include infrastructures like gridded fields to prevent erosion, pebble mulch gardens to maintain soil moisture, and construction of complex irrigation systems. Ultimately, Puebloan strategies were inherently flexible in order to respond to climatic instability and drew on resources that could quickly be replaced. This meant frequent crop rotation or village movement and minimally harvesting live timber. At the beginning of the colonial period, all of these strategies existed in a complex system of landscape management. The continuity of the system assured stability within the Puebloan world as part of the colonial process. This system was brought into direct contact with one initiated by Hispanic settlers. Despite earlier contact, actual Hispanic settlement of the Rio Grande Valley did not occur until 1598, when a colonizing party of 500 people and 7,000 head of livestock entered present-day New Mexico and began reshaping the landscape. During the 17th century, the colony maintained a tenuous existence with an economy dominated by the agro-pastoral endeavors of the colonists, and extraction of labor from indigenous population. Agricultural activities included the cultivation of cereal crops like wheat and maize, as well as investments in other introduced crops like chilies, peaches, and watermelons. And here I mean introduced chilies. I know they're native to the Americas, but their existence on archaeological sites is associated with Spanish colonization, bringing them up from Mexico. The Spanish preference for wheat suggests that these practices changed patterns of water usage and competed for space with indigenous maize fields. Aside from these crops, Hispanic settlers also introduced livestock to the Rio Grande Valley. Herds of sheep created new environmental stresses because of their extensive water needs and their reliance on weedy plants for food. Consequently, animal grazing may have significantly impacted the agricultural productivity of the region through overgrazing while simultaneously expanding what could be seen as productive land. Through both the imposition of pastoralism as well as the disruption of indigenous maize production, Hispanic settlers began to reshape the carefully constructed prehistoric landscape. To investigate this landscape transition, a single pollen core was collected from a small pond at the Lenore Curtin Wetland Preserve, located approximately 1/2 mile from the LA 20,000 site. This location was chosen because it represented the local environment while providing the best possible conditions for pollen preservation. After field sampling, the core was subsampled in increments of 2 centimeters, 5 of which were selected for radiometric dating. In total, 12 samples were analyzed, 1 to represent the modern environment, and 11 sequential samples to generate a pollen profile from the 14th century to the present day. Each sample was counted to 500 grains to allow for the identification of potentially rare taxa. For the purpose of this paper, only those samples associated with the landscape transformation occurring immediately prior to and during the Spanish colonial period will be discussed with emphasis on key taxonomic groups. This is the entire pollen profile generated from this data set, and the section we'll be talking about is essentially from here down, with this line up being approximately the mid to late 19th century to the present day. Perhaps the most conspicuous palynological evidence of colonial agricultural regimes would be the identification of introduced domesticates within the pollen profile. In fact, this was expected since these crops were seen as being essential for Hispanic survival in New Mexico and were also heavily preferred as dietary staples. Despite this, no fossil pollen from introduced crops like wheat, watermelons, chilies, or peaches was identified. A number of factors could account for this absence, including the fact that pollen for some introduced crops, like chilies, are morphologically indistinguishable from local wild plants, making their specific identification unlikely. This is in contrast to the imported European staples like wheat, which can be differentiated from both wild plants and maize, but may not have appeared in the pollen record due to factors relating to pollen dispersal. The lack of this pollen does not contradict archaeological evidence of their cultivation, but rather suggests that these agricultural regimes were not easily established or as widespread as may be thought. Furthermore, there could have been a dynamic spatial relationship between the cultivation of introduced plants versus native ones. In contrast to the absence of introduced crops is the identification of maize in both colonial and prehistoric pollen samples. 1 grain of maize pollen was identified in a sample dating AD 1580 to AD 1631, and another in a sample dating AD 1395 to AD 1433, denoted as samples 11 and 15 respectively. This is interesting because it suggests agricultural continuity between the prehistoric period and the 1st century of Spanish colonization. The specific reproductive qualities of maize serve to reinforce this hypothesis because maize pollen has relatively high density, which reduces its potential dispersal range. In this regard, it seems likely that Hispanic settlers were using the same location that indigenous communities had historically used for maize cultivation, or that the location of LA 20,000 may have been in close proximity to active Puebloan fields. Given the presence of water in the current wetland preserve, it is likely that both groups were attempting to make use of the location to increase agricultural productivity. It is also worth noting that if the maize identified within the historic sample was in fact of indigenous cultivation, the patron of LA 20,000 would have been in violation of colonial law, which forbade the establishment of ranches within 3 leagues of Puebloan villages. In this case, the pollen data depicts a localized competition for resources that had a direct impact on colonial actions. The cultivation of domesticated crops, like maize, also had an impact on the occurrence of wild taxa within the local ecosystem. In this case, the occurrence of maize and pollen samples correlates with a significant reduction in the pollen from the Chenopodiaceae Amaranthus group. This group consists of weedy taxa that range from small shrubs to bushes, with some examples including four-winged saltbush, which is pictured here, Atriplex canescens, various types of Chenopodium, and Amaranthus. In sample 11 and 15, the Chenopodiaceae and Amaranthus group declines to 13.5% and 11.4% of total pollen, respectively. This is a significant decrease from the contiguous samples, which show Chenopodiaceae Amaranthus as between 16 and 18% of total pollen. The negative correlation between this group and the appearance of maize pollen suggests that the land use patterns associated with cultivation have direct impact on this specific plant community. The change in this community may be associated with land clearance for field preparation, whereby the weedy taxa, in this case Chenopodiaceae Amaranthus, were removed from the area prior to cultivation, only to return once the fields were left fallow, since these plants prefer disturbed soils. In addition to land clearance, the reduction in Chenopodiaceae Amaranthus pollen may have been associated with changing water management regimes. Other palynological studies have indicated that an increase in populations of these plants correlates to a lowering at the water table and subsequent presence of drier soils. In this case, it is possible that during fallow periods, local soils would have become drier through lack of irrigation. This would have promoted the growth of Chenopodiaceae Amaranthus in comparison to other weedy plants. Likewise, heavy irrigation could have stimulated the growth of other taxa, however the present data cannot verify this phenomenon. The palynological data for maize cultivation and its environmental effects illustrates continuity between prehistoric and colonial land use regimes, but is not the complete story. Within this seeming continuity, Hispanic settlers also inflicted drastic environmental changes. Returning to the population of Chenopodiaceae Amaranthus group, throughout the prehistoric samples, there is a normal variation between proportions of total pollen, with a significant variation co-occurring with identified maize pollen. In sample 9, this pattern is broken when the Chenopodiaceae Amaranthus group becomes 19.6% of total pollen. This is the second highest proportion in the entire pollen profile and may indicate a significant environmental shift. Chronologically, this sample corresponds to approximately AD 1689 to AD 1745, which can be described as the period of recolonization following the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, a time of considerable colonial growth. The increase in this taxonomic group is most likely due to the growing prevalence of livestock in the Rio Grande Valley during the 18th century, particularly sheep. By 1827, documented data indicates that there were nearly 250,000 sheep and goats in the Rio Grande Valley, with 62,000 residing in Santa Fe alone. Overgrazing of this livestock would have caused substantial erosion and an increase in soil aridity, thus influencing the expansion of Chenopodiaceae Amaranthus group. Additionally, some plants in the genera proved to be browse resistant, meaning that they are less vulnerable to overgrazing. During the colonial expansion of pastoralism, browse-resistant plants like four-winged saltbush would have flourished with the reduction in less hardy grasses. This process of taxonomic replacement and increasing aridity can also be observed in variations of arboreal pollen. As with other locations in the Southwest, the most prevalent taxonomic group in the pollen assemblage is the Pinaceae family, which is locally represented by several species and genera of evergreen trees, including pinon pine, ponderosa pine, and several species of fir and spruce. Despite the fact that most of these trees are restricted to the mountains, pine trees are disproportionately represented in the palynological studies because they produce large volumes of pollen that can be dispersed over 100 kilometers by prevailing winds. For that reason, most of the pollen observed within the profile was likely a combination of local production and pollen transported by wind from mountain slopes. Throughout the soil profile, there is a generalized trend towards an increasing proportion of pine pollen, which can be attributed to increasing levels of preservation. This trend is punctuated by the substantial deviation that occurs in the sample dating AD 1580 to AD 1631, which is sample 11. Hispanic settlement, and this corresponding to Hispanic settlement. In this sample, total Pinaceae pollen becomes 41% of total pollen, as compared to the maximum of 27% prior to this point. Pinaceae pollen then receives to 34% of total pollen, which is a notable difference from the prehistoric layers. Although it might be instinctive to characterize this as an expansion of pine forests, it more likely represents a change in depositional processes associated with forest clearance. As the colonists cleared riparian forest, they provided the conditions necessary for greater influx of pine pollen, which was once blocked by dense canopies. Additionally, land clearance has been noted to increase soil erosion, consequently moving pollen that is accumulated on local slopes into low-lying wetland areas, accounting for disproportionate representations. Although not a conscious part of the agricultural regime, this data speaks to important ecological relationships created by the Spanish that served to alter the landscape. Palynological data from this study speaks to the complicated ecological relationships created through the process of European colonialism in New Mexico. These relationships were a result of the merger of anthropogenic landscapes with a new system of agropastoralism that slowly reshaped it. The changes that occurred were not as conspicuous as the implementation of completely new crops or methods, but were manifest in the changing communities of wild plants. In this way, Hispanic agricultural regimes began remaking the environment rather than simply replacing the indigenous one. Through analysis of these changes, we can better understand the role of human communities in landscape creation and how specific strategies foster ecological continuity or change. Thank you. And I'd like to thank Heather Trigg, who advised this research, and the Andrew Fisk Memorial Center for Archaeological Research at UMass Boston for funding it, and Susan Jacobucci for helping with pollen identification.
There's time for a few questions.
Yes.
This was all based on one core, is that right?
Yeah, we took one core from the local vicinity of the site, and it was mainly to see if we could find something close by that would give us adequate preservation to look at a long sequence. There have also been some samples processed from unit profiles on the site and from some close archaeological contexts, but they didn't give us the controlled chronology we were looking for in this study.
So each of those depths for the other two plants you talked about correlated with their age?
Yes, yeah. So we had 5 radiocarbon samples taken, and then we used these to approximate sedimentation rates between these samples. And really what we were looking for in this was to see that it moved in a linear fashion and we didn't have redeposition of other soils or something like that.
I mean, forward salt bush is used for the ash forward salt bush is added to corn.
Exactly.
So you're talking about a reduction of forward salt bush as the colonial, as the Spanish arrived.
I think the reductions, there's another sample where we have maize as well, and it's from the 19th century, which I think is interesting, and we also see a decline in it. So I think the significant declines, we aren't probably seeing a land clearance episode. But in the modern samples, it becomes much more prevalent, and I think it's because the soils are much, much drier. If you looked at the first slide, which is the site today, the dominant plant across the site is four-wing saltbush. It's everywhere. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.